Hello everyone, my name is Jimmy. As you might have seen in my last video, which was the introduction, I had mentioned I wanted to make a video going over how I constructed my marbled Newt enclosure, my marbled Newt named Wilfred, how I built it, the history of his enclosure, how I go about building an enclosure, things like that. At this point, I'm trying my best to record at least some of the process of actually building and making enclosures and how I'm going about that. I have some future projects hopefully planned, or just videos in general, but the reason it's been so long, life has been happening, but I would like to start posting regularly. But regardless, I wanted to just throw this out there. So we're going to be starting going over the species, and like I said, this is kind of a PowerPoint, or I didn't say that, but I'm saying that now. This is a PowerPoint because I actually don't have a ton of videos or pictures of the construction process, so I just thought it was easier to just do it like this. I can map out everything, and then hopefully you can take something away from this video. If you have a marbled Newt, hopefully this helps you, or just hopefully it's interesting in general. So, going over their species just in general, like I said, if you're looking them up or you're looking for their common name, marbled Newt is pretty much the only name I hear, maybe the European marbled Newt. They are in the same family as the crested newts, or the same genus, however you want to, same family too, but very closely related. They're found all throughout, I think it was Western Spain, Portugal, upwards into France. They're considered a relatively low temp animal compared to other reptiles and amphibians you might keep, although I feel like newts and salamanders like it usually a little colder than the rest. So they can actually handle slightly warmer temperatures compared to other species like eastern newts. But regardless, they still like it quite cool, and they like it with 60 plus humidity. They come from forests, and they're almost always found near some kind of body of water, whether it be just a puddle or a pond or a stream, and their enclosure needs to represent that, so they're terrestrial and aquatic, or semi-aquatic, however you'd like to categorize that. And they usually feed on worms, insects, invertebrates, things like shrimp, custodians, which we'll get into all that. But just starting from there, once I had learned or decided that this is the species that I had wanted to keep, I wanted to go over how exactly I do research in terms of how I would like to design their enclosure. So I usually start with trying to find their native range. So using just this map of the different species in their genus, it'll show the range of all the different ones. I believe the T. cristaceus, I'm probably butchering that pronunciation, so I apologize, is the crested newt, if I'm not mistaken. So you can see that's a very common newt in the hobby. They're usually quite aquatic. They're found much wider than everybody else. But you can see the species in question, which is T. marmoratus. They are found in the range that I had mentioned earlier. So usually when people are talking about designing an enclosure or a bioactive enclosure for an animal, a lot of it has to do with their native range and the way that they exist in the wild, which is the right call. But some people will just look at this and they'll be like, cool, I gotta match France and Spain and Portugal for their environment. So obviously, one of the big questions is, where are they most commonly found in those areas? Because their range can vary quite a bit, but they're usually rarer or more common in other areas. So the way I usually go about this is I use iNaturalist to help me with this. iNaturalist isn't perfect at anything, obviously nothing is, but what I pretty much do is I allow it to help me narrow my search down to a more specific area. So as you can see, I look up the species on iNaturalist, and I get the map in the top right corner, and you can see it's a very general list. If you don't know how to read that map, any of the orange boxes are where they're found, and the darker shade of orange means that they're more heavily found in that section that the map is highlighting. So essentially, I just zoom in on a very deep part, and then I can then go from there. As you can see, when you zoom into the left-hand side of Portugal, they are very commonly found along that coast, not necessarily on the coast, but just closer to the coast than the rest of the country. And then you can find a city that they're very most commonly found in, and then going from there, I can use their city data or city weather data as essentially a template for things like temperature and humidity and things of that nature. And iNaturalist will also become important later, but we'll get into that as well. So what I decided to do is I got these ranges slash just rough estimations for their temperature from care sheets. So just trying to do your best. If you talk to people that have done research, they usually find YouTube videos or care sheets, things like Reptifiles, any of those sources. Anybody who's been taking care of these animals, you'll see what they're doing and how they're keeping their animals alive. And I compiled a relative average of each of those, like overall temperature range, the maximum, the minimum, and then went from there. I also then I picked the city, which I found that Porto, Portugal, which I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that or not saying it correctly. You can see the weather data here. So there's the temperature and then the low and high temps, which we'll get into another graph later that shows the average temp as well. But as you can see, the high temp in both of these charts is actually just about 77. It can vary a little bit. The chart on the right is in Celsius, so I'd have to convert that to Fahrenheit, which I can't do in my head. But you get the gist. For about 1 to 2 months of the year, the maximum temperature can hit 77, which is essentially, as most people have seen, that's like the maximum temperature that they can be at in captivity, but only for a short period of time. Anything below 75 is considered ideal. And the weather data seems to match that. Now, humidity, a lot easier. Humidity seems to be pretty consistent throughout most of the year in this city. And then you can also see a lot more other information in the chart to the right that also has the average temperature. And you can see even in July with the minimum and maximum, the average is only 67. So definitely more heat tolerant than other species, but still definitely like to keep it a little cooler. So now you know the type of environment you're trying to create from a climate perspective. What about literally? Well, so obviously you're going to do research and you're going to hear descriptions about where these animals are found in the wild, whether it be ponds or streams or marshes or rainforests, and all of that is interesting, but all of these individual biomes or habitats, as if you will, have their own unique aspects about them, whether it be you're talking about as you can see, we can get the humidity range here. So as I was saying, apologize for the weird break. I like to use iNaturalist for finding pictures of where people are finding these animals in the wild, if possible. Sometimes the pictures aren't really good. A lot of the times they're in like a bucket or something. They had grabbed the animal and they transported it to somewhere to take a picture, which is obviously fine. Obviously, one of the big useful parts of iNaturalist is the location data, but using the pictures of people of finding them in the wild is definitely useful. One of the things in both my research and using iNaturalist that I found very conflicting was whether or not they should be in an aquatic or a terrestrial setup or some combination. Seeing people keep them usually was terrestrially, but I've also saw aquatic setups. I heard that they needed aquatic setups once they hit about 3 to 4 years of age. From all of the research that I can gather, they only need to be aquatic if they're breeding. So if they are not given a proper water area, then that's okay, as long as they have access to either some small body of water, a water dish, or maybe even just moist substrate. I would probably provide them with some kind of water, but regardless, I wanted to clear that up as to why I made the enclosure the way I did. And their diet and the custodians, or cleanup crew, if you will, and why I decided to pick them. When it comes to their diet, honestly, pretty much anything that they can fit in their mouths. That's an invertebrate, crickets, a variety of different worms, isopods. I feed him bloodworms and aquatic shrimp, sometimes like brine shrimp. I'll feed him a little brine shrimp. And pellets. I don't use pellets super duper often, but I do think that as a treat, and he loves them, they're acceptable. They have I also enjoy that they have a lot of vitamins and nutrients in them. So I go from there. And the custodians, I added some dwarf white isopods and some Cubaris marina. I added those just to see how they would do. I haven't seen them since, so I would consider that a failure, especially since regardless, long term, the dwarf whites would outcompete them. I also added a unknown species of microscopic millipede that you can see in that one photograph. I don't know the species. I've had them for years. I have them in a couple of different setups. I've been trying for years to ID them. I know they're a flatback millipede of some kind, but they do not get any bigger than that. That picture is through a microscope. So if anybody knows, then have at it. Also, I included springtails. I did try and add some orange springtails, but I've never seen them since. But right now, tropical ones are doing just fine. And I decided not to add worms. I was considering it, but then I thought it wouldn't be stable enough with the way I constructed the enclosure, which we'll get to soon. So, here he is. That was the first day I got him. He's even still in his little deli cup in that picture. And then his little quarantine home. So, going from there, I started drawing up the way I wanted his enclosure to look. So, these drawings look probably terrible. But the idea was just for me to map out my thoughts and to get a good way of visualizing everything. And my overall idea was to essentially have it be land with essentially like a little puddle area with this particular piece of wood, which I didn't end up using, which then this section at the bottom is actually the final version of what I wanted to do. I even had the idea of having the background be completely rocks. That didn't turn out. But just going on to the actual tank, this is what it was after I had foamed it and put all of the hardscape together. I had 2 pieces of Mopani wood on the right-hand side with a rock structure underneath of it that actually has a pump built into it. So you can see the egg crate on the left along the back wall. There is a pump that is fastened behind that and the tube that runs through the expanding foam out of the rocks and will come out as a little waterfall. And the egg crate that's kind of sloping up to the right, or to the left, is going to be the slope from the land to water. So the water area would be filled on the right-hand side, and it would curve up into the land area. I was trying to get a decent mix, about 2/3 of the enclosure land and 1/3 water. It didn't have to be super deep, just deep enough where he could be underwater if he desired to. So I then pretty simply foamed up, or I siliconed and then used, I believe it was the Biodude background blend. I just had a bunch of it from a previous project that didn't turn out, and I decided to just keep trying to use it. I still have a bunch of it. I just have to figure out what to do with that. But as you can see, just had the expanding foam. You can see the pump is fitted back there. I ended up needing to fill in those gaps on the left and right with sponges, and then I filled in the bottom part as well. So you can see, if I back up, to create the land area, I decided to make the drainage layer, or the false bottom, be just essentially sponge mats that I could layer up and build off of, and then substrate can go on top of it. So to prevent substrate from falling through the gaps, To prevent substrate from falling through the gaps, I used essentially just like drainage layer fabric and sponges to fill in all of the gaps and make it so substrate can't pass through. And then it looked like this. This is actually not technically the final version, as I had gotten rid of and changed around some plants later on. But as you can see, the water area on the right, all of the plants going up the side. You can see this is definitely a much more final version. I replaced a lot of the bigger plants with moss. I covered the one leaf in fern moss, which I wish I still had that moss. And then there's the area up above as well, which was covered in moss and actually an epiphytic orchid that did really well up there too. I also have some frogbit and duckweed in the bottom portion. And like I said, the waterfall and some other plants like the alocasia and the peperomia as well. I ended up replacing that one plant in the very center. I cannot remember the exact name of it, but I replaced it with a begonia. So here's some pictures of him in this setup. And this setup did very well at first. It was a good grow out tank. He loved the upper portion of that enclosure. He would always be up there. So that was good to know. But in addition to that, I decided to actually redo the setup because one day I couldn't find him. And I ended up ripping apart the entire enclosure in an attempt to find him again. So just essentially jumping right into the next iteration of his enclosure. Here are the drawings that I had. I was actually working with a Zoomed 25-gallon front opening enclosure, which was a much better footprint. The other footprint was a 10-gallon. And you can see my general idea here is I wanted some kind of water feature running through the center of it. And then I was planning on using rocks, and I wanted it to be very fern-based. I had a lot of preliminary drawings, but then the actual construction worked in a very similar way. Still used sponge as the base, and I decided to use a method of running the pump underneath using a PVC tube through that one piece of silicone, or that one piece of driftwood in the back left corner. And then I used other pieces of cork flats to essentially create this little slope that water could trickle down into. And then I used expanding foam and super glue and the background blend to try and make it a little bit more seamless. It was neither here nor there because it was going to get covered in things like moss and stuff later anyway, but I just thought it would be better. I then filled in the left-hand side where the water area was going to be with the Biodude drainage layer. I just like that for this type of project because it's very fine. It's relatively lightweight, and I think it looks somewhat natural, so I didn't have to worry about... I used sand on top of this later, which you'll see in a moment, but if over time the little bits of the drainage layer would like come up and shift around, I didn't mind that because it looks like rock. So you can see I then filled in this... Oh, and then I should have mentioned this as well. I have this big piece of cork bark here that has moss on it. I got that at a pet shop, a pretty famous pet shop around my area. And it was covered in this moss, and I just knew that it would grow in very nicely in the humid environment, which, long story short, it did. And then I filled in the behind there with polyester fluff to help build up that area a little bit. And that worked perfectly. As you can see, there is one big flaw with this, which I would have changed in retrospect. I can't access the pump anymore. At the time, I was like, it's fine. If I need to access the pump, I'll just, pull out the plant and do it. Now I really don't want to do that, and I should access the pump because the pump's not working nearly as well as it was. The flow is very limited nowadays, so I might go through and do that. Live you learn. So... But, as you can see, the waterfall is working pretty nicely up here. And then, continuing, this is the next picture I have. It's essentially, it completed the day that I completed it. So, going just from left to right, I used a variety of different plants. I used Hemigraphis raponda, a whole bunch of different ferns and Saginelia species. Fittonia, that rabbit's foot fern in between where the waterfall is. In the water itself, I used a bunch of Anubias nana petite, and then the Pilea depressa. I might be butchered. I think there's a subspecies or something like that mixed in there. And then I used duckweed and dwarf hairgrass for the water area to try and create like a little grassy effect. That didn't really turn out either, but... this was it a couple of months later. It looks a lot better here, a lot more filled in with all the plants, especially the Pilea. That Pilea took over in the setup long term. And this tank has been running ever since. I built this January 2nd, no, 7th, 8th, I'll throw the number on screen, of the date that I had officially constructed this. And then the current date is the 26th of November. So it's going to be coming up in a year almost that this setup has been running. And honestly, it has been great. Here are some pictures of him the first day I put him in it, enjoying his little water feature, and just when I had put him in the enclosure. Normally, I would do a more formal introduction and like put him in a cup and let him venture off on his own. But honestly, it was one of those moments where I felt confident just releasing him into it. The lights were going to turn off about an hour after this, so then he could just like hunker away. It would become night, and he can then feel safe. So, and he didn't show any signs of being stressed. He immediately went in the water and started ducking his head underneath it. So I'm going to throw up some more footage of the enclosure nowadays. And like I said, only real problem with it is that the flow of the pump is really low. I've done a couple of things to try and get it up, regardless. It's worked a little bit, and it's not a huge deal. Even if the pump had completely died, the system would still run. The water would just need to be changed more frequently. But overall, I do water tests on this enclosure, maybe not as often as I should, but still relatively often, at least once a month, maybe even once every other month. And so far, water testing has been great. The values have been very positive, slightly lower pH, but ammonias and nitrates are actually at 0, I assume, which is due to all the plant growth with all the roots. There's a huge root system now underneath all of the polyester filling, and a bunch of the plants took off. Like I said, I'm going to throw up a bunch of photos and videos of the setup over over the months that I've had it, especially the way it looks now. And he enjoys it very nice. One of the biggest things that people had warned me about, and something that maybe some people would be thinking, is he's such a small newt. In the world of newts, he's actually quite big, but he, him himself, is actually quite small. And people told me that I would not be able to see him. He would hide, and I would essentially never be able to see him. And I had been tongue feeding him at this point, so, I would have to dig him up to feed him. It would ruin the setup. And I will say, none of that has happened. He comes out all the time. If you look at the picture like this one, you can actually see that on the left-hand side, there's that little cork tube. That actually is where he hides most of the time. It's like the little entrance to his home. The fern in the back also is taking over the setup. If you hear me echoing, it's because I'm looking behind me at the setup, and that fern has actually choked out some of the plants, which is kind of par for the car. I can't speak apparently, but it's essentially just part of keeping these enclosures. Plants are going to die. Some plants are going to succeed. Natural selection at its finest. Yeah, I've also found some snails. I did have a picture of some snails in the cleanup crew. I didn't introduce them. They must have came in on either the dwarf hairgrass or the duckweed or on something. But either way, I would consider this setup a very big success. I hope this enclosure build was interesting. I don't know exactly what I'm going to do next. I've had a couple of projects not come and go, but I've had some smaller projects come up, which I'm hoping to share at some point. Maybe I'll talk about them in very short bursts. And a part of this process, in addition, like I mentioned in the introduction video, is I don't just want this video to be to tell you how to do things. If anybody has any suggestions about how to improve the setup, or where I could have done things better, or if you think that there is something that I could have done better that I did terribly in this one, something I normally would do is pick species of plants that I try my best to pick native species, or especially if that species has a particular niche or behavior that is influenced by a particular type of plant. I know that, like the same way that dart frogs use bromeliads a lot for laying their eggs. I try and cater their environment to their natural behaviors. Very limited research on that front with this species, so I just picked whatever I thought would work best for the environment rather than going like straight up native. And I will say I think that things have been relatively successful. I wouldn't say that this enclosure is a good representation of what they would live in the wild, but it is a good enclosure when it comes to making sure that he has everything that he needs, and I believe that he thoroughly enjoys it. I see him use every single inch of this enclosure, and if you have this species or are thinking about getting this species, I would definitely recommend getting him this footprint. As I mentioned in his first setup, he really enjoyed being high up, and although this is a terrestrial system, he does have layers. He has like the ground coverage, which is closer to the water, and then he can go up into the ferns and hang out high above. And then there's the edge, which kind of overlays the waterfall, and he's always looking over it and stuff like that. So I think he thoroughly enjoys this setup, and I hope that you guys do as well. If you have any questions, feel free to put a comment down below, or even direct message me on things like Instagram, which will be in the link below, or the description below. The link for that will be in the description. If you guys, again, have any comments, any feedback whatsoever, I would always appreciate it. So, thank you very much for watching. As I already said, I will let you know I won't let you know, but the next video will be whatever it ends up being. So it'll either be one of two enclosures that I had recently designed, one of which is a small nano enclosure for hopefully a new edition that I'm going to be getting within the next maximum year, but we'll see. And then one of them was a fish tank, actually, which maybe goes against the average theme of this channel, but I do enjoy a good paludarium / riparium as well. So yeah, thank you very much, and I will see you in the next video, hopefully.